My name is Jordan, and I've been working at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions for 8 years. 8 long years of watching, learning, and quietly building a reputation as someone who gets things done without drama. I'm what you might call a mid-level operations manager. Not flashy, not the loudest voice in the room, but I pay attention. I notice things. And over the years, I've built a network of contacts that most people would find surprising for someone at my level. You see, I learned early in my career that information is power, but knowing how to use that information wisely is what separates the smart players from the casualties. I've seen plenty of both during my time in corporate America, and I've made it my business to always be on the winning side of office politics without ever appearing to play the game at all. The story I'm about to tell you happened last spring, and it involves our regional director Marcus Blackwood. Marcus was the kind of man who wore his authority like an expensive cologne, heavy, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. He had that corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a personal assistant named Sarah, and the kind of ego that required constant feeding from everyone around him. Marcus had been with the company for 12 years, working his way up from a junior account manager to his current position as regional director for the entire Northeast Division. He oversaw 4 departments, managed a budget of over $20 million, and had the ear of the CEO whenever he wanted it. On paper, Marcus Blackwood was the epitome of corporate success. In reality, he was a predator who had learned to disguise his worst impulses behind a veneer of professional competence. Sarah Martinez had been Marcus's secretary for 3 years. She was 26, hardworking, and unfortunately, completely devoted to her job. Too devoted, as it turned out. Sarah came from a working-class family in Queens. Her father worked construction, her mother cleaned houses, and she had 3 younger siblings who were all trying to make it through college on academic scholarships and whatever financial help Sarah could provide. Sarah had graduated magna cum laude from a state school with a degree in business administration, but like so many recent graduates, she'd found that the job market was far more challenging than her professors had led her to believe. When she finally landed the position as Marcus's assistant, she'd been unemployed for 7 months and was facing the very real possibility of having to move back in with her parents. Marcus knew all of this, of course. Marcus made it his business to know everything about his employees' personal lives, their financial situations, their family dynamics, their hopes and fears. He collected information like other people collected stamps, and he used it just as strategically. I should mention that I've always made it my business to know things too. The difference is I use information to help people, not exploit them. It's a distinction that matters more than you might think. I first started paying attention to Sarah about 6 months after she was hired. Not because I suspected anything inappropriate was happening. At that point, Marcus was maintaining perfect professional boundaries, but because I noticed how stressed she always seemed despite being, by all accounts, excellent at her job. Sarah was one of those people who arrived at the office 30 minutes early and stayed at least an hour past closing time every day. She kept meticulous records, anticipated Marcus's needs before he voiced them, and managed his calendar with the precision of a Swiss timekeeper. But despite her obvious competence, she always looked like she was one mistake away from a panic attack. I made it my business to understand why. During my lunch breaks, I would sometimes strike up casual conversations with Sarah in the break room. Nothing intrusive, just friendly small talk about weekend plans or favorite restaurants. Over time, I learned about her family's financial struggles, her student loans, and the enormous pressure she felt to succeed in her first real corporate job. What I also learned was that Marcus had made it very clear to Sarah that her position was precarious. Not through direct threats, but through a constant stream of comments about the competitive nature of the job market, the company's need to maintain lean staffing, and the importance of employees who could handle stress without complaint. It was psychological manipulation, pure and simple. Marcus was creating an environment where Sarah felt grateful for the opportunity to be overworked and underappreciated. And unfortunately, it was working. The first sign of real trouble came in January of last year. Sarah had been looking pale and tired for weeks, often rushing to the bathroom during meetings and keeping a sleeve of saltine crackers in her desk drawer. When she started avoiding the coffee machine, Sarah, who had previously consumed at least 4 cups of coffee per day, I began to suspect what was happening. My suspicions were confirmed on a Tuesday afternoon when I was working late and overheard a hushed phone conversation coming from the supply closet. Sarah was scheduling a doctor's appointment and specifically requesting the earliest available slot. She mentioned being 8 weeks along and asked about prenatal vitamin recommendations. Sarah was scheduling a doctor's appointment and specifically requesting the earliest available slot. She mentioned being 8 weeks along. Now, here's where things get complicated, and where my years of watching Office dynamics started to pay dividends. Marcus Blackwood was married. Happily married, according to his social media presence, and the collection of family photos that decorated his office like shrines to domestic bliss. His wife, Catherine, was a prominent figure in local charity circles. She organized fundraisers for the Children's Hospital, served on the board of the Art Museum, and had recently been featured in a lifestyle magazine article about successful power couples. They had 2 teenage children, a son who played varsity lacrosse and a daughter who was apparently headed to an Ivy League school on an academic scholarship. But I'd started noticing things about Marcus's behavior that didn't quite align with his image as a devoted family man. The late-night meetings with Sarah that seemed to have no clear business purpose. The way his hand would linger on her shoulder during presentations, just a beat longer than was appropriate. The expensive gifts that appeared on Sarah's desk. A designer handbag here, a jewelry box there. Always with no accompanying card or explanation. Most telling of all were the business trips. Marcus had started including Sarah on client visits that had never required administrative support in the past. Weekend conferences that somehow necessitated sharing hotel accommodations. Working dinners that stretched well into the evening hours. I'd been in corporate environments long enough to recognize the pattern. Marcus was grooming Sarah, using his position of authority and her financial vulnerability to create a situation where she felt she had no choice but to accommodate his advances. By February, the situation had become impossible to ignore, at least for someone who was paying attention. Sarah was showing, despite her attempts to hide her condition with loose clothing and strategic positioning during meetings. She'd started wearing flowing blouses and cardigan sweaters, even on the warmest days, and she'd stopped participating in team lunches where the conversation might turn to personal topics. Marcus, meanwhile, had become increasingly paranoid and controlling. He started scheduling unnecessary late-night work sessions, always with Sarah and always in his office with the door closed. He moved her desk closer to his office, claiming it was for efficiency, but making it impossible for her to have any private conversations with other employees. Most tellingly, he began making comments about the importance of loyalty and discretion in the workplace. These weren't direct threats, but they didn't need to be. Marcus had refined his manipulation techniques over the years, and he knew exactly how to communicate expectations without leaving himself vulnerable to formal complaints. I've learned that when powerful men start talking about loyalty, they're usually about to ask you to compromise your integrity in ways that will benefit them and destroy you. The breaking point came in March, on a Thursday afternoon that I remember with perfect clarity because it was the moment I decided that watching from the sidelines was no longer an option. Sarah had requested time off for a medical appointment. Nothing unusual there, just a routine request submitted through the normal channels. But Marcus denied the request, claiming they were too busy with the Henderson account to spare her for even a few hours. When Sarah tried to explain that it wasn't optional, that her doctor had specifically requested this appointment and that she couldn't reschedule, Marcus became aggressive in a way that I'd never seen before. I was in the break room, ostensibly reading emails but actually paying attention to the conversation happening near the copy machine. Marcus's voice was low but intense, and the office layout meant that I could hear every word through the thin walls that separated the common areas from the main workspace. Sarah, I need you to understand something very clearly. Your position here is not as secure as you might think it is. The company is always looking for ways to streamline operations, especially in administrative roles that don't directly generate revenue. If you're not fully committed to your job, if you're going to start prioritizing personal matters over work responsibilities, then maybe we need to have a serious conversation about whether this is the right fit for you. The threat was crystal clear, even though it was couched in corporate speak. Marcus was telling Sarah that her job depended on her willingness to sacrifice her health and her baby's health for his convenience. The threat was clear, even if it wasn't explicitly stated. Sarah's response was barely audible, but I heard her agree to reschedule the appointment. I also heard her crying softly once Marcus had returned to his office, And that's when I knew that my days of passive observation were over. That afternoon, I made a decision: who had been documenting his behavior, who had connected Sarah with the right people in HR, who had been quietly building the case that destroyed his career. For 12 years, Marcus had operated under the assumption that his position made him untouchable. He had believed that his connections, his performance record, and his institutional knowledge would protect him from consequences no matter what he did to the people under his authority. He had never considered that one of those people might be watching, documenting, and planning. He had never imagined that a mid-level operations manager could have the knowledge and connections necessary to bring down a regional director. Most importantly, he had never understood that his victims might have allies, people who were willing to use their own power and resources to ensure that justice was served. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply letting someone realize how completely they've been outmaneuvered. I finished my coffee and walked toward the exit, passing directly by Marcus's table. As I approached, I could see him working up the courage to say something, probably to demand an explanation or to accuse me of orchestrating his downfall. As I passed his table, I heard him whisper, "You." I paused, turned back to look at him, and smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile or a vindictive one. It was the smile of someone who had kept a promise to themselves and helped ensure that a predator could never again abuse his power. "Marcus, how's the job search going?" His face cycled through several different expressions: anger, recognition, defeat, and finally, a kind of horrified understanding of just how thoroughly he had been outplayed. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? That he was angry about being held accountable for his own actions? That he was surprised to discover that his victims had found someone willing to help them fight back? I walked away without waiting for an answer, leaving Marcus Blackwood to sit alone with the full weight of his own choices. I was right. What would happen to him if I reported it? That would depend on what the investigation found. But based on what I've observed, and especially based on what he said in Thursday's meeting, I think the consequences would be very significant. Thursday's meeting? I realized she didn't know about Marcus's public meltdown, since she'd been at her medical appointment. "Marcus called a staff meeting while you were gone. He spent 10 minutes explaining to the entire team why employees who prioritize medical appointments over work are liabilities who should be fired. 14 people heard him say that pregnant employees need to consider finding different jobs." Sarah's mouth fell open. "He said that? In front of everyone?" "He said that and a lot more. And it was all recorded through the company's conference system." Sarah took the business card and tucked it into her purse. "I need to think about it." "Of course. But Sarah, don't wait too long. Every day you wait is another day he has to build a case against you. And from what I've seen, he's already started." That weekend I didn't hear from Sarah, and I tried not to think about what she might be going through. I knew from my research that victims of workplace harassment often struggle with feelings of shame and self-blame, even when they've done nothing wrong. I also knew that coming forward would require enormous courage, especially for someone in Sarah's financial position. She wasn't just risking her own livelihood. She was potentially jeopardizing her family's ability to pay for college tuition and basic living expenses. But Monday morning my phone rang at 7:30 a.m. It was Daniel. "Jordan, Sarah Martinez called me yesterday. We talked for over an hour, and I have to tell you, this situation is even worse than what you initially described." "How so?" "The pattern of harassment goes back almost to the beginning of her employment. Marcus has been grooming her for months, using her financial vulnerability and job insecurity to create a situation where she felt she had no choice but to accommodate his advances." Daniel's voice was grim. "We're talking about a textbook case of quid pro quo sexual harassment, combined with pregnancy discrimination and abuse of power. If this goes to court, the company could be looking at damages in the millions." "What happens now?" "We open a formal investigation immediately. I'll be sending a team to your office tomorrow morning to interview witnesses and collect evidence. Marcus will be suspended pending the outcome, and Sarah will be placed under the company's whistleblower protection policies." The wheels of corporate justice were finally starting to turn. "Jordan, I have to ask, how long have you been documenting this situation?" "About 6 weeks. "And what made you decide to get involved? You could have easily stayed out of it." It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. It was a fair question. I could have easily stayed out of it. Because I've seen what happens when people with power abuse it, and I've seen what happens to people who don't have anyone in their corner. Sarah needed someone in her corner, and I was in a position to help. Well, based on what you've provided and what Sarah has told us, Marcus is in serious trouble. We're talking about immediate termination, and quite possibly criminal charges depending on what else we uncover. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Daniel's team arrived Tuesday morning, conducting interviews with every employee who had witnessed Marcus's behavior toward Sarah. They reviewed emails, calendar entries, expense reports, and travel records going back 2 years. What they found was a pattern of escalating harassment and abuse that was even more extensive than I had realized. Marcus had been systematically targeting female employees for years, using his position to extract personal favors and accommodate his advances. Sarah wasn't his first victim. She was just the one who got pregnant. The investigation team discovered at least 3 other women who had been subjected to similar treatment over the past 5 years. 2 had eventually quit after being given impossible performance standards when they rejected Marcus's advances. The 3rd had been transferred to another department after filing an informal complaint that was buried by the local HR representative. It turned out Marcus had been running his own personal harassment operation for years. Most damaging of all was the electronic evidence. Marcus had been sloppy about covering his tracks, apparently believing his position made him untouchable. His company email contained dozens of inappropriate messages to female employees. His expense reports showed a clear pattern of personal entertainment disguised as business expenses. His calendar revealed meetings with Sarah that had no legitimate business purpose. The investigators also discovered that Marcus had been falsifying performance reviews to create documentation that could justify firing employees who didn't cooperate with his demands. Sarah's most recent review, completed just weeks before the investigation began, contained criticism of her work quality that was directly contradicted by praise from other supervisors and client feedback. During this 3-week period, Marcus became increasingly erratic. He seemed to sense that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. The suspension had been explained as routine administrative leave related to a company-wide policy review. But Marcus was smart enough to know that routine administrative leave didn't usually involve surrender of company devices and restricted access to company systems. He started making desperate phone calls to his contacts in senior management, trying to find out what was happening. He showed up at the office despite being told to stay away, claiming he needed to retrieve personal items from his desk. He even tried to contact Sarah directly, sending flowers to her apartment with a note asking her to call him. Paranoia has a way of making guilty people reveal themselves. The most telling incident happened during the 2nd week of the investigation. Despite being on administrative leave, Marcus somehow learned about the team meetings being conducted by Daniel's investigators. He managed to get past building security and confronted several employees in the parking garage, demanding to know what they had told the investigators. When security was called to remove him, Marcus made threats about the consequences of disloyalty and warned that he had the power to destroy careers. Everything was captured on the building's security cameras, and everything was immediately forwarded to Daniel's team. The threats were a violation of the company's whistleblower protection policies and gave the investigators grounds to recommend immediate termination, even before the formal investigation was complete. But Marcus wasn't finished destroying himself. His final mistake came when he tried to use his connections in senior management to pressure the investigators to close the case.